intra 的指示，谢谢。
So for Slido, you can just go on your smartphones and enter event code 8054. And we'll see this pop up here. And then once it pops up, it'll go right to our event, and you can enter in questions for the presenters. That way, it'll be a lot easier to see what all questions we have from the crowd, so we can get through the questions more quickly. And then here, again, is Mixler, the Chinese translation services. So, today we will have presentations in both the rooms, and we have great presentations in both. So, the first presentation in 270-101 will be National Conjunction University's own Julio Linares. He will talk on funding-based income, finance, and the counter movement. And so, actually, if you're going to view that presentation, you can actually follow Julio now. You can follow him to the other room. So once we get done with the introductions, just go to 270-101, which there should be signs directing you. It's also the room where we will have coffee and refreshments.
那现在为大家介绍如何使用 Mixer 还有 Slido 这两个网站。如果各位想要听取各位待会有问题的话，可以以中文的形式发问，会由我或者是中原大学的同学帮各位翻译成英文的部分。那如果想要由线上提问的话，可以进入 slido.com， 然后输入这间教室的 code， 在两边的墙壁都会有数字8054，按 Join 登录之后，会进入到这个页面。由 Type Your Question 这个地方可以发问，可以打中文或者是英文，然后呢再进行线上的票选。发问之后，画面的右侧会出现一个赞的符号。那如果各位对这个问题也感兴趣的话，那就请各位按下你们的赞。然后我们待会也会替各位向演讲者发问。那接下来是 Mixer 这个网站，请各位在手机输入 mixer.com， 然后 dash 台湾 based income。对，然后就会进入到这个画面，然后大家就可以一起在线上收听，谢谢。
So our first presentation in this room will be Gary Flomenhoft. He's provided us video and he will provide a Skype Q&A. So now you have a moment to get settled before we start the video. If you're going to view the presentation in room 270-101, you can follow Julio now.
会议即将开始，我们在这间教室我们即将在另外一间教室由 Vermont 大学的 Gary Flow， 我们在这两间教室都会提供今天的会议以及投影片。芝士大学的 Linus 会将出席融资基本收入的讨论，在270101教室，那就请跟着一起移动。
So, now we will go ahead and begin the presentation from Mr. Again, we'll let everybody get settled if they're going to 270-101.
会议即将开始，在我们这间教室即将有 Vermont 大学的 Gary Flomenhoft 来讨论澳洲融资基本收入。
This is probably my favorite cartoon, Basic Income. It's drawn in 1896. Back then, they were wondering, how are we going to get paid when machines are doing all the work? This is something that we hear about all the time nowadays, that robots and artificial intelligence are going to replace human labor. even back in the 70s, Mr. Ford said we really only need to work about 2 hours a day to meet all of our basic needs. So what happened to all of our leisure time? Working hours have actually stopped decreasing after decades, declining. Around 1970, work hours stopped getting shorter, and more and more people are working, both men and women in households are both working. You can see the drastic increase in women in the workplace. So people are actually working more hours than they used to, rather than less. So what happened? The most famous enclosure of the commons took place in England. It started actually in the 1500s, but just in 100 years, until 1860, over 20% of the British land area was taken from common land and put into private property for sheep farming, and this was all done with the cooperation of the Parliament. So industrialists, farmers got the Parliament to basically take the common land away from the peasants, and this was essential for the creation of the Industrial Revolution. So all these people who were living on feudal lands and using the commons for subsistence were forced off the land into the cities for to work in factories. And this is what Charles Dickens, the famous writer, called satanic mills. These factories where people just worked massive hours, children worked, and their conditions were horrible with massive pollution. This was a result of the enclosure of the commons. If we look at what's happening now, I call it the new enclosure of the commons. Instead of just land, now essentially everything is being enclosed and privatized and corporatized. And it's really not anymore the market against the state. It's actually the state acting on behalf of market actors in order to privatize everything about the commons. Starting with money and finance, if you can take over the monetary system, that gives you a lot of economic and political power. From there, you can take over governance and democracy, and you can also take control of the land and resources. You can globalize the economy, so you basically destroy the power of labor, take away their leisure time, and you could privatize education, and so on. And this is essentially what's happened with neoliberalism, globalization, and the Washington Consensus, what Margaret Thatcher referred to as there is no alternative to neoliberalism. It's essentially an enclosure of the entire commons, and this is really how the 1% gets their wealth, is through charging rent for the use of the commons. So just to explain the enclosure of money, the Bank of England recently issued a report explaining that commercial banks produce 90% of the money supply. So government is no longer creating the money supply, it's now being produced by private banks, and then they charge interest on this money that they create. So they have massive amounts of control over the money supply. One example of where government produced their own money was the greenback in the U.S., which President Lincoln created in order to finance the Civil War. And currently, governments borrow money from banks and pay interest when they could issue currency interest-free themselves, but they have privatized the entire monetary system. So when the Federal Reserve in the U.S. was issuing quantitative easing, $1 trillion a year to the banks, if they had issued that to the population, that would have amounted to a basic income of $3,000+ per person per year. So that would have been quantitative easing for the people instead of for the banks. What the enclosure of democracy and governance in the U.S. and probably worldwide over 80% of the people who win are the ones that have the most money. Or should I say, the person with the most money wins 80 to 98% of the time. And billions of dollars are spent on elections, and recent Supreme Court decisions allow unlimited campaign donations. And my friend Eric Zensi basically calls it the money party, and the money party always wins.
In terms of the closure of land and resources, banks own a large fraction of the land, and the GFC was a huge land bubble, big asset bubble, and it collapsed because land values are privatized even though they're publicly created. In terms of oil royalties, the US is extremely low, so most of the value of the oil is privatized.
An example of the enclosure of land is the rapidly increasing price of housing, which is now in Australia over 8 times annual income, when back in the 80s it was only 3 times annual income. So that's another reason why leisure time hasn't increased and more people have to work, is because the price of housing is just drastically going up, and it's just another asset bubble driven up by speculation.
Another reason for the lack of leisure time is the fact that even though there's been a huge increase in labor productivity, wages have not increased for over 30 years. All the increases in productivity have gone to the owners of corporations and executives, and the average worker has gotten nothing from the increase in labor productivity over the last 30 years. That's another reason why the work week hasn't gotten any shorter.
And so this helps to explain why the number of working hours hasn't decreased, even though we have this massive increase in productivity. Because of all the factors I mentioned, the work week's not getting any shorter.
When it comes to knowledge and education, you can see the huge increase in student loan debt. In the US, it's over $1 trillion, where government used to pay for